War of the Worlds, The Resurrection. A novel by J.M. Dillard. Chapter 27. It was normal morning activity along the flight line at Nellis Air Force Base. A typical day. The sun, bright, harsh, superheating the tarmac until black heat waves glimmered against the near horizon. A squadron of fighters was lined up on the main runway. Every few seconds one of them streaked up into the sky with an ear-splitting roar. Both inside and outside the hangars, repairmen were busy maintaining helicopters and a couple of small prop planes. Every so often, a jeep full of soldiers rumbled down the service road. Everyday stuff, nothing unusual or suspicious at all. Certainly not about the two airmen who strolled across the tarmac past a hangar toward a runway. Nothing unusual at all, except for the mottled purplish bruises that ringed each of their necks, or the slight clumsiness of their movements. No one noticed, and no one stopped them, as they made a sudden detour toward two of the big troop transport helicopters sitting on the outskirts of the runway, and climbed into them. By the time one of the workers heard the choppers start up and tried to yell out that the copters were scheduled for maintenance, not takeoff, it was too late. Self-conscious and hot in camo fatigues, Suzanne sat in the driver's seat of the drab green Ford sedan and tried not to appear nervous. Think military, that was the key. She straightened and put her hands at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock, the ideal driving position, on the steering wheel. Seated next to her, Harrison wore a uniform identical to hers and Ironhorse's. She could only hope it looked less ridiculous on her. Harrison leaned next to her and said under his breath and through his teeth, "Try to relax, will you? You look like you've got a poker up your—"
"Go to hell,"
she whispered, and looked through the open car window at Ironhorse as he walked up to the front of the commander's bungalow and saluted the base commander, General Arquette, a stern, jowly, gray-haired man who wore a carefully pressed blue uniform and the same cool air of confidence Ironhorse exuded. Arquette returned the salute, then turned to narrow his eyes at Suzanne, peering in through the tinted windshield at Ironhorse's entourage. She swallowed, and did her best to look bored, but felt absolutely convinced that the general would never mistake her and Harrison for military personnel. It was hot, and the car windows were all rolled down. Suzanne listened carefully to see what Arquette had to say to Ironhorse about his companions. But oddly enough, the general said nothing, just turned his attention politely back to the colonel. The two of them began to stroll the short distance in front of the bungalow. As unconvincing as she and Harrison might be, Ironhorse was brilliant in his role. The man was a truly inspired liar. She would have to remember never again to believe anything he said. He walked next to the general, his hands folded behind his back, Arquette's aide a few respectful steps behind. "I'm told the outlying areas of your base have ideal terrain for conducting my survival training classes." Ironhorse's expression was far more pleasant and respectful than Suzanne had ever seen it. But the general's expression was less than friendly. He narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "If I'd had advance warning," he complained, "I could have made some arrangements. This is most irregular." Rather than become defensive, Ironhorse nodded sympathetically. "Know what you mean, General. It was last minute for us, too." He glanced back at the aide, then lowered his voice confidentially. "Special mission coming up. Can't really talk about it." Arquette's hostility melted instantly and was replaced by a spark of keen interest. He lifted one bushy brow questioningly. "South of the border?" Ironhorse replied with a wink. Arquette nodded approvingly. "About damn time." He gestured to his aide to come closer. "Let me have Captain Matthews here take you on your survey." They turned and headed back toward the ford. Suzanne tensed. If Arquette insisted on giving them a chaperone, the little masquerade would be over in an instant. She didn't even know how or who or when to salute. Maybe Ironhorse could BS his way into Nellis, but she and Harrison didn't know enough about the military to fool anyone, except from a safe distance. She tilted her head to give a worried glance at the black metal insignia pin on her collar. Ironhorse had filled her in on the fact that the rank it indicated was that of corporal, but she couldn't remember which way the two little chevrons were supposed to be pointing. Right now they were pointing upward, and as Ironhorse and Arquette neared the sedan, she hoped like hell her rank was right side up. But Ironhorse seemed totally unfazed by the general's offer. He smiled glibly and replied without missing a beat, "I appreciate the offer, sir, but it's unnecessary. I think we can find our own way." The smile widened. "General Wilson said we weren't to inconvenience you in any way." "Well, if you need help," Arquette said, and walked him back to the passenger side of the sedan. Ironhorse stopped at the rear door. "You'll be the first to know, sir. Thank you." He waited for a moment, then cleared his throat and tilted his head to glance pointedly at Harrison. Suzanne caught the look and nudged Harrison's combat boot with her own.
"I think he wants you to open the door for him," she whispered.
"What?" Harrison turned to glance at Ironhorse over his shoulder. Apparently the look on the colonel's face was enough to convince him, because he scrambled out of the front seat, came to a ragged attempt at attention, and held Ironhorse's door open. After the colonel crawled in, Harrison slammed the door shut, then retook his own seat in the front of the Ford. General Arquette bent down to peer into Ironhorse's window. "Always glad when the Air Force can lend you Army boys and gals," added as a patronizing afterthought at the sight of Suzanne. "A helping hand." He lowered his voice to address Ironhorse. "Keep me apprised. Love to get a piece of that mission." "Will do, General," Ironhorse answered cheerfully, then settled back in his seat and addressed Suzanne, his tone becoming sharp. "Get a move on, Corporal. We haven't got all day." She raised an eyebrow at that and exchanged irritated looks with Harrison. Obviously, the colonel was relishing his role just a bit too much. Time to put him back in his place. She started up the Ford and jammed her foot down on the accelerator. The results were satisfactory. The car lurched forward, slamming Ironhorse in a most unmilitary fashion against the upholstery. She waited until they were out of Arquette's view to snicker. Harrison wasn't quite so reserved. He turned around and laughed aloud at the colonel, who didn't seem particularly amused. "Hey," Ironhorse said indignantly. "What was that for?" Suzanne blinked innocently up at him at the rearview mirror.
"You said, get a move on, Colonel. I thought I was just doing that."
Harrison was grinning over his shoulder at Ironhorse. "I think it's Dr. McCullough's subtle way of saying she doesn't appreciate the way you bossed us around." "I had to, or it wouldn't have looked right," Ironhorse protested. "And you're supposed to open the door for an officer. And by the way, Blackwood, the next time you come to attention, remember this." He said it rapid fire, like a Marine drill sergeant barking out orders and loving every minute of it. "Stand erect, heels touching, feet at 45-degree angle, fingers curled, thumb to index finger touching the seam of your pants. Now to salute." Harrison gave a disbelieving smile as he shook his head. "Knock it off, Ironhorse. Call me a conscientious objector if you want. But if you think I'm going to go to all the trouble to remember that, you're crazy."
"Admit it, Colonel,"
Suzanne said.
"You enjoyed giving us orders."
Ironhorse frowned and was about to deny it, but something made him change his mind. "Well," a grin spread slowly over his face, "maybe just a little." Ironhorse directed them through the hilly terrain, a mixture of scrub pine, forest, and desert, down a dirt road to a remote, quiet area where a lone hangar sat, bordered on its rear flank by sparse forest. "Stop here," the colonel ordered, although they were still several hundred yards away. Suzanne brought the Ford to a smooth stop. The hangar door was closed, and as far as she could see, there were no signs of life, only the occasional thunder of a jet passing overhead.
"Looks harmless enough."
Ironhorse climbed out of the car, this time without waiting for Harrison to open the door, and went around to the trunk. Suzanne glanced over at Harrison.
"What if we're wrong? What if they're not here after all?"
Harrison's mood had abruptly become somber. "I hope to God we're wrong, and they're not here. And yet, at the same time, I have to hope that we're right, and they are." She nodded. If they weren't there, she and her two companions would be safe, but an opportunity to stop the aliens would be missed. She moved to open the car door. "Come on, Corporal, move it," Harrison called with more than a little sarcasm. Suzanne climbed out, and Harrison followed. Ironhorse had already opened the Ford's trunk and was pulling out equipment. He handed Harrison a holster which held a Beretta. "Here, Blackwood, you're going to need this." Harrison drew back and shook his head. Ironhorse sighed, disgusted. "Fine. I'm sure the aliens will respect your disapproval of guns."
"Harrison,"
Suzanne put a hand on his arm.
"we have a responsibility to stop them here. Extreme situations call for extreme actions. If the Colonel and I are killed, you are obligated to stop them."
Harrison stared reluctantly down at the weapon in Ironhorse's hand, his expression one of distaste. "All right, this once, but I don't like it." "We'll be sure to make a note of that," Ironhorse said. He pulled the Beretta from its holster and held it where Harrison could see it. "I've released the safety and cocked it. All you have to do is aim and fire." "Aim and fire," Harrison parroted. "Just remember one word and you'll be okay," Ironhorse told him. "Bras." "Bras?" A whimsical expression crossed Harrison's face. "I had no idea the Army was this much fun." Ironhorse nodded. "That's right, bras. Breathe, release, aim, and squeeze." He demonstrated with the pistol, then handed it and the holster to Harrison, who slipped it on. The colonel reached into the trunk again and brought out another holster, which he proffered to Suzanne.
"No thanks."
She nodded at the equipment case still in the trunk.
"I've got something even better in there."
"Let's hope so," the colonel muttered. He handed the case to her, and another satchel to Harrison, then slammed the trunk shut. Together, the three of them made their way toward the hangar. Not many miles away, in a clearing, the troop transport helicopters had landed, and were in the process of being boarded. To all outward appearances by the members of Delta Squad, who climbed the metal steps with heavy, awkward movements.